Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Ana Elisa Luna, and I am the External Affairs Manager for Latin America at the World Bank. I'm very grateful for your presence here today in the launch of our semi-annual economic update, Consolidating the Recovery, Seizing Opportunities for Green Growth. Here with me today is the World Bank's Chief Economist for Latin America, Bill Maloney. Good morning, Bill.
Morning, Ana.
So before handing it over to Bill, who's going to walk you through some of the main findings of the report, just a few housekeeping issues. We would be grateful if you have any questions. We received some in advance and we'll go to them as soon as Bill finishes his presentation. But if you have other questions, please post them on the Q&A section of the chat. I want to also remind you that the report is under embargo until noon Washington DC time. So grateful if you can observe that. We will do our best. This is we'll be spending the next 45 minutes together. We'll do our best to get to all your questions. If for some reason we don't, we will do our best also to follow up with you. So I think that we're ready for you, Bill. So let me hand it over to you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Ana. Can we see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you all very much for coming today, and I'll be brief so we have time for questions. The report is divided in two chapters. The first one is called Consolidating an Uncertain Recovery, and the second is Seizing Green Growth Opportunities. Across the course of the next couple of minutes, I want to show how these two issues are actually quite linked. To begin with, LAC is recovering slowly and largely recovered its levels from before the pandemic. And if you look at this graphic here, taking 2019 as a base year, we can see that by 2023, we're expecting LAC to have more or less 5% growth above what it had before the pandemic, which is not the best among the global economies. It's one of the least dynamic regions in that respect. In fact, when we look at growth going forward, we're forecasting 2.3% for 2022, 2.2% for 2023, and 2.4% for 2024. And this is important both because it's not sufficient enough to really make a dent in levels of poverty in the region, but also it's a return to the growth rates of the 2010s, where we were growing 2.2% when the rest of the world was growing 3.1%. So we have a structural problem with growth that is more than just a pandemic that we have to work on. The social costs of the pre-pandemic we're still struggling with. Employment has largely recovered, but much is informal. We haven't fully recovered formal employment. Poverty, while having fallen, is still above pre-COVID levels. And the 1.5 years lost in schooling due to shutdown of school may imply a 10% loss in lifetime incomes of this generation of students, and clearly will also affect our productivity as a region going forward. Finally, the programs to support firms and to support households during the crisis clearly had important fiscal implications that we're still dealing with. Our level of debt as a fraction of GDP is down from 75% to 70% of GDP, but that's still higher than the 60% that we had prior to the pandemic. Perhaps the least welcome news is the return of inflation. If we look at the graph here, inflation now in the region on average is somewhere between 6 and 7%, which is well above the levels that we've seen over the last 10 years. And that is also substantially above inflation targets in many countries in the region. And that's put policymakers in a difficult situation where meeting their inflation targets will require putting up interest rates, which in turn will dampen economic activity. So it's a standard dilemma of growth versus price stability. And that's complicated by the fact that our analysis shows that over the course of 2021, the drivers of inflation have shifted from pent-up demand from the pandemic or government stimulus to more supply-side issues, bottlenecks that we know from from the global value chains, from higher food prices, from higher petroleum prices, energy prices. So this is all going to be a complication for policymakers going forward. The region needs an aggressive reform agenda if it's really going to raise growth rates. And this would be in education and infrastructure and innovation. We have to do this, as we mentioned in the previous semi-annual in October, and we'll keep repeating these messages. We have to do this within a very limited fiscal space. And this implies not only looking at how to raise revenues, but also to revisit the efficiency of public spending. Roughly, we estimate 4.4% of GDP is lost in inefficiencies in government transfers, in inefficient procurement, and in human resource policies that are inefficient. And that, if we were to make reforms of the state, would both free up resources for the important investments we need to do in growth and equity, but also arguably strengthen the confidence that our citizens have in their government. All of the reforms that we're talking about are taking place in an evolving global context, both in the short run and the long run. The first is the Ukraine crisis, which we don't know how long this is going to be an issue for, but it has already reduced our 2022 forecasts by about 0.4%, from 2.7% to 2.3%. And the channels are several that we can already see. Higher commodity prices, for instance, for energy or for commodities, help exporters, but they hurt food and energy importers, and that's going to particularly hit, for instance, the Caribbean. The reduction in advanced country growth, particularly in Europe, slows the lack of recovery through reducing our markets. And the higher inflation this is causing, both in the advanced countries and in the developing countries, is going to require stronger restrictive measures to keep inflation in check. Finally, there are lost input and output markets, and we can talk about that a little bit later. The second issue, which is a medium-term issue but not a long-term issue, the increased urgency about dealing with climate change has led to a change in the global environment and an increased focus on green initiatives around the world. And that will pose challenges and opportunities for our region, and we want to put some of these on the table in the second chapter. To begin with, LAC contributes maybe 8% of global greenhouse gases as a region, and as a share of the global total. But despite that relatively small contribution, the impacts on climate change on the region are far-reaching. To begin, the impacts on poverty we expect by 2030 are to throw perhaps 2.5 to 5 million people into extreme poverty by 2030. And you can see from the graph on the left that that can be up to about 1% of the population that we're talking about in some countries. Heat and drought will lead to declining agricultural output, as we're already seeing in some parts of the region. Extreme weather events lead to disruption, but also infrastructure damage, and we estimate this is about 1.7% of GDP annually. Again, particularly the case in the Caribbean, where storms and hurricanes have become more intense over time. And finally, a man-made challenge to us arises in the form of carbon border adjustment measures, or CBAMs. And these are likely to be tariff measures that are put on imports that reflect whether those imports are certified as green or not. And the region will have to be ready to meet those requirements. The very good news is that LAC has tremendous green comparative advantage. And the challenge for us is to look these squarely in the eye and say, okay, we have these advantages, now how do we leverage them, both for growth and for sustainability? To begin with, LAC's electricity generation matrix is one of the greenest on the planet. As you can see from the graph to the right, over 50% of our energy comes from renewables, most of it hydro, actually. And that's going to be very good because our exports, we can say our exports are intensive in green generated electricity and energy. And again, when we talk about complying with CBAMs, that will be a major advantage. We have tremendous potential in wind, in solar, in geothermal, and in green hydrogen. We have abundant inputs for emerging green technologies. 58% of global lithium reserves, which are used intensively in batteries, are found in our region. 48% of global copper reserves are found in our region. Again, the question is going to be how we can leverage these reserves for dynamic and diversified growth. We're very rich in natural capital. Roughly 50% of global biodiversity is found in our region. Our extensive forests can be used as carbon sinks and can form the basis for exports of environmental services in the form of carbon capture, for instance. Key message of this report, and something we want to stress, is that both the growth and the green agendas are linked. They're fundamentally technology adoption agendas, and they require reforms to the region's education, entrepreneurship, and innovation systems in order to both make the transition smooth, but also to maximize the benefits we get from our comparative advantage in this region. I'll turn it back over to Ana Luna right now. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you, Bill. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We're monitoring the chat to see the questions you're posting in the Q&A section. And we also got a few questions earlier. So, Bill, I'm going to start with those before going into the ones that are posted on the chat. And I think that, clearly what is happening in Europe is having, as you said, an impact on the region. And it's already, had an impact in terms of our forecast. Can you go a little bit more into how you see the war in Ukraine impacting the region? And also, it seems like this is not, like with everything, it's not a uniform impact. Some countries are being, hit in different ways. So could you just talk to us? There was a question from Laura Sepulveda from the VOA on this, and a few other people have asked. So can you just spend a little bit more time talking about how you see what's happening in Ukraine impacting the region?
Sure. So I think the first thing to keep in mind is that this is not likely to be over very soon. And hence, the channels that we've already seen emerge affecting the region are likely to remain important for the foreseeable future. And we're also learning about new channels every day. As you mentioned, the impact, most obviously, the impact is going to differ radically across the region. Countries that export commodities or export energy are going to be in a better position. Countries such as the Caribbean, which import food and energy, are likely to be hit hard, and that's going to require probably programs to buffer the impact on households of these kinds of price rises. We have experience with this from 2009, when food prices, for instance, hit similar highs in nominal terms. Some channels that are more surprising, but will nonetheless have an impact, are just emerging. For instance, it turns out that I think Brazil imports something like a third of its fertilizer from Russia. And that's not just Brazil, it's across the region. But obviously, higher prices or less availability of fertilizer is not only going to depress output, but it's going to exacerbate the food crisis that's emerging globally and just compound the issues we've already seen in terms of food prices. Also, some countries, I think Ecuador, Russia is the fourth largest exporter. So exports of bananas and shrimp and the like are likely to be curtailed over the medium term. And of course, as I mentioned, the impact on inflation. We were hoping that inflation would be a transitory phenomenon due to the kind of supply bottlenecks coming out of value chain problems. Those forces are not likely to be temporary. So we're going to be dealing with inflation longer than we thought, and that will have the usual impacts on growth.
Thanks, Bill. And we got another question regarding, at the very beginning, you showed that the growth for the region compared to others, and we again see Latin America lagging behind all the other regions. And so, could you tell us a little bit more about, why this is, and what's the bank's view on what the countries in the region need to do to get out of this path of kind of slow or stagnated growth?
So obviously, this is a subject for a seminar in itself, but there's a long-standing list of reforms the region needs to work on. On the one hand, as I mentioned, we are not great at adopting new technologies. We have not been. Our productivity as a region has been low for the last. Productivity growth has been very low over the last decade and a half. And that comes from a variety of things. It comes from weak education systems. It comes from innovation systems which are disarticulated. That's to say that the people doing research are not tightly linked to the private sector. It comes from questions of entrepreneurial capabilities and needing to make our firms more able to export. If you look at, given all the trade agreements that we have signed over the last 20 years, Latin America underexports. And that suggests that we have a reform agenda building stronger exporters and making sure that our environment, our infrastructural, facilitates exporting. On the other hand, there's a long-standing agenda about competition that we have to think about. We still remain a little bit inward-looking, and introducing more competition in our markets would, combined with strengthening our innovative capacity, would help in both making our existing firms more productive, but also helping us diversify into other industries.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to now go to some of the other questions that we've received. We have a couple of journalists connected from Argentina. So I'm just going to share with you the two questions that they've submitted. One comes from Infobae, and it's about whether Argentina will suffer a higher inflation and recession this year because of the macroeconomic instability described in the fund program and because of the war in Europe. And also asked about, the IMF program mentions that the bank is going to work with the authorities to improve the efficiency of social spending and energy spending. So a question around what that means in terms of policies. And the question from La Nación is about the inflation outlook for Argentina and how the IMF program may help to cool prices.
Right. So we have to be honest and just acknowledge that the war in Ukraine is going to increase inflationary pressures and probably as a result depress growth forecasts for the entire world, and that includes Latin America. To the degree that governments are struggling with this, both by rationalizing their budgets and through more restrictive monetary policy, that leads to that difficult trade-off that I mentioned earlier in the presentation that all countries are going to face. And as far as the question about improving the efficiency of social spending, the bank has been working with Argentina for over 25 years on the design of social programs. To take one, there's a universal child allowance. And we seek, obviously, to design programs which reach those who most need to be covered. In terms of energy spending, we've also been working with both provincial and national authorities for some time, and we'll continue to do so, particularly as this issue of energy security becomes more important.
And Bill, there's also a question from Valor Económico about whether you can share more about the forecast for Brazil, the GDP. And I think that this is another one where, as we see the fall in the forecast for the US and Europe is having an impact on many of our countries. So what else can you tell us about Brazil?
Brazil, we're expecting to. Brazil grew roughly 4.6% last year, and we're expecting 0.7% this year. It is one of the countries that has had the hardest time recovering from the pandemic, and that's perhaps partly due to the fact that it was hit especially hard by the pandemic. So the next couple of years, we're predicting 0.7 and then 1.3 in 2023 and then 2 going forward. And again, these kinds of factors that I just talked about, for instance, the unavailability of fertilizer and the complication of value chains are all depressive in that sense.
And I'm going to just pivot from that to another question that we got, and you already touched on this, but I wonder if there's more that you could say about the whole issue of inflation. It is one of the big concerns in the region, and what can the countries in the region do to tackle this?
So again, if you read the U.S. press, you'll see the exact same debates going on. Coming out of COVID, there was both sort of a spillover of demand stimulus policies put in place during the pandemic, and then increased spending as a result of people being freed from a lot of the restrictions. And so that originally put some pressure on inflation, and that requires controlling aggregate demand. And that's exactly why in the summer you saw numerous countries begin to raise the interest rates in the central banks in order to dampen demand side pressures that would increase inflation. As I mentioned, this has been complicated by the fact that inflation has shifted to be more of a supply side phenomenon. So petroleum prices, depending on who you talk to, are at very high levels. Prices of food are very high levels. And unfortunately, that's not being driven by demand. But nonetheless, the challenge that every country has, and again, you see this in the US, is you want to be able to control inflation before it gets built into wage contracts and becomes a wage price spiral that will require much more draconian measures further on down the line. So, for instance, the debate in the United States exactly right now is whether the Fed is acting quickly enough to ensure that we don't build inflation into our expectations, making it harder to root out later. I imagine that the countries of our region are facing some same sorts of questions. It's not an easy trade-off. The one thing we do know is dealing with it sooner is preferable to having to take much harsher measures further down the line.
Thanks, Bill. And there is a question from the National Publishing Company in Barbados asking about what we see the outlook for the Barbados. And I have a couple of more questions from colleagues in the Caribbean. So this is the first of a few.
Right. So Barbados is a very good case to look at. It has tourism is a major industry there, and that's a face-to-face person industry. And as a result, it was especially hit hard by the pandemic. The economy contracted in 2020 by like 13.7%, something like that, 14%. And it hasn't fully recovered. And if you note in our report, most of the Caribbean countries haven't been able to recover precisely because tourism hasn't recovered. We're projecting 1.4% for this year, and in 2021 we had 1.4%. In 2022, we're projecting 11.2%, reflecting the fact that tourism is recovering. Now, that recovery is made possible partly because Barbados has one of the highest vaccination rates in the Caribbean, with roughly 54% of the population fully vaccinated. That's key because you have to be able to control not only the last variant, but we also have to defend against potential new variants to the degree possible. Unfortunately, in much of the Caribbean, and it's partly a question of availability, but it's often also an issue of vaccine resistance. So as a result, the areas of the region which have the least share of fully vaccinated citizens, and which are showing the lowest growth rates in vaccination, are precisely in the Caribbean. And that is going to impede the recovery of tourism, and hence of growth in the region. It's worth mentioning in many of these countries, the bank provided quite substantial aid during the crisis. I think to Barbados is about $100 million to mitigate the impacts of COVID.
Thanks. And then there's a question from the Village Voice News and Guyana asking about what are some of the projects and programs Guyana can undertake to create growth while still capitalizing on its booming oil and gas sector. And I think this links also to some questions we've received around that tension between investments in oil and gas versus this need to move to a more sustainable green growth path that focuses more on renewables. But in the case of Guyana, what can you tell us?
Right. So at this point in history, discovering oil is definitely a complicated blessing. Over time, we know the world is going to be moving to more renewable sources of energy. Over the medium term, oil and gas are going to continue to be in the mix. Our program at the bank, we are not involved in particular with developing the oil revenues. We tend to focus more on issues of human capital development, education, flood risk management, strengthening financial services. We are advising the government on how to build a robust legislative and regulatory framework to improve the governance and transparency of the Environmental Protection Agency, with the hope of guiding the development of Guyana in a way that is going to be the greenest possible and inclusive for all.
Thanks, Ben. There's also a question about, you mentioned that the region, even though it is not one of the biggest sources of emissions, is being greatly impacted by climate change. And there's often this discussion around the trade-offs, but I think that one of the questions is, are there really opportunities for the region here, and where are those opportunities? Where is it that the region could really, the leap forward in terms of a more, sustainable growth path?
Right. So, as you mentioned, it's one of the great unfair injustices of the world that the people who are creating global warming are not necessarily the people who are going to be experiencing the consequences of that global warming. And we do contribute relatively small. It's not negligible, and it's something we want to bring down. And our contribution happens mostly in agriculture, actually, and in land use management. And we can make progress on that quite easily. There are trade-offs, and we have to look at those trade-offs squarely in the face. Over time, countries that are heavily dependent on hydrocarbon exports are going to find those as a less and less reliable source of income as they're phased out globally. And we will have to explore new kinds of technologies to make our manufacturers greener and our agriculture greener. And we know about the trade-offs, for instance, in managing forestry, trade-off between preserving forests and generating new land acreage for farming. All those issues do imply that there are trade-offs in moving to a new path, a more sustainable global path. But what the report wants to stress is that we're extremely well positioned as a region to take advantage of this new green world order that's emerging. Here's a fact, for instance, when you look at Mexico, tremendous potential for green hydrogen, as does Chile, as does Argentina, as does Brazil. And in fact, the infrastructure that we have, for instance, in Mexico, can be adapted to new technologies like green hydrogen. But this is going to require all these evolutions moving into smart agriculture, into different sources of into green hydrogen or wind power. All of these require some conscious planning on the part of the government and working with foreign investors to facilitate the transition and to leverage them the most possible. And this is where we're stressing our need to strengthen our educational, our entrepreneurial support systems, and our innovation systems so that we can more nimbly manage the new technologies that are coming. If we are more able to quickly introduce green farming techniques, smart agricultural techniques, that makes the transition. That means we don't have to stop farming. We stop, livestock farming. It just means we have to do it in a different way. And in the process, we may learn how to do it more productively, and that'll be a boon for growth. So focusing on improving our capacities in those areas is key both for the growth, but also for the green agenda.
Thanks, Bill. And there's a question from Bloomberg asking if you can expand on the number you shared about the 10% income loss for students of this generation. How many people are we talking about? Are there other education indicators that outline the pandemic's impact, like lower graduation rates, lower attendance levels? And I just want to jump in and tell Patrick that that we are doing a lot of work around the impact of the pandemic on education. The region did experience the second longest school closures in the world, and that significantly has impacted around 170 million students. I'll let you, Bill, just go a little bit more into this. But Patrick, if you're interested, we're also happy to connect you with our education expert. We're in the process of updating a report we released last year on this. But Bill, anything you want to say more on this?
No, I mean, actually, we could provide you with the number of days, for instance, that children were out of school, and provide more information on the methodology used to calculate that 1 to 1.5% year loss in education, and that's across the board. That's an average. But I think the best is probably, as Ana Luna mentioned, the report of the education group, which precisely details the impacts of COVID on the education system and on educational attainment, is coming out very soon, I think in the next month. And there'll be more detail there. This is a key thing. This is a key issue, both because that loss in education obviously affects the income of the students who didn't get educated, and hurts productivity going forward, but also it's unevenly distributed across population. Kids that had access to the internet could attend class and could do their homework online. If you're in a less advantaged family where you've got a flip phone as your means of communication, you can't do that. So we started with unequal educational outcomes across social classes in the region. And those have only been exacerbated by the pandemic. Acting now, the new report in education is coming out, I think, in the next month. We'll go more into that.
Thank you, Bill. And just a quick reminder, there was a question that's already been asked, but just a reminder that the report is under embargo. Just a clarification, Bill, then the graphs that you shared in your presentation, are they in the report? And if not, then we'll just make sure to share the presentation with all the reporters who are attending this. But are the graphs from the report?
They're all on the report.
Okay, thanks. But we're also happy to, if anyone wants a copy of the presentation, we're also happy to share it with you. So there is a question, also another question on Brazil, and in the chat from Folha de Sao Paulo, and they want to know if about the possible effects of the Brazilian election on the economy and how the fall of the dollar could affect the region.
My forecasting skills in the political realm are not as strong as those in economics, so maybe I'll sidestep that particular question. How the dollar moves is, of course, important to us, largely through the channel of our existing externally denominated debt. One thing that the rising interest rates in the United States does for, the problem it creates for our policymakers is precisely that leads to a depreciation of our currencies, which at once transmits international inflation more readily to us through the pass-through through the exchange rate depreciation, but it also increases the foreign currency, the local currency value of our external debt. So in general, part of what monetary authorities are trying to do is precisely mitigate the depreciation of our local currencies against the dollar to prevent those two events. So to the degree that the US dollar strengthens, that is not good for us. And to the degree that it weakens against our currency, that tends to be better.
Thanks, Bill. And I'm just going to, I don't see any other questions. I'm just going to give one last chance if anyone has been sitting on the fence, if you want to post a question. Otherwise, I think that we're going to call it a day. I think that's it. We are going to be sharing the contact of our press officer. If anyone has any other follow-ups, if there's something we didn't answer, you need clarification, please really reach out to us. I really want to thank Bill for the report and for the presentation. And thank you everyone for attending this morning.
Thanks to everyone for coming.
Thank you.